Good afternoon and welcome to our ongoing series of temple speeches. My name is John Minott, a tour guide historian at the temple, and my topic will be anti-Masonry from the 17th century to the present. Around 1900 French print, The Enemy is Him. As you can see, hardly a flattering representation of Freemasonry. This is really more, despite the comprehensive title, it's really more the highlights of anti-Masonry and more not global, more focused on Western Europe and the United States. Over the years, the main objections to Freemasonry have been its nefarious secrecy, that it's a rival religion, that a man can't be of one religion and also be a Freemason. We have very gruesome oaths. People suspect our loyalty to our countries, that we're more loyal to international Masonry. And progressive ideas are anathema both to the fascist regimes or communist regimes, basically authoritarian regimes. And we're also accused of weird conspiracy theories, New World Order and the Illuminati, that Freemasonry as an organization is either bent on world domination or already secretly in control of world politics. We have not fared well in the Islamic world, nor we were banned in China in 1949. The Masonic definition I'll be using are for what we call regular lodges, which are the lodges loosely associated with the Grand Lodge of England. Now we'll also be discussing what are called continental lodges, which are more in Catholic countries. And as we shall see, they have more of an anti-clerical and aggressive relationship. The Tower of Babel, medieval print. Freemasonry has been described as a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. Most of our symbols are the tools used by the medieval stonemasons, with which we do have a link. It's not all that robust, but certainly by 1717, when the first Grand Lodge was created, we were dedicated to knowledge and not training stonemasons. And we probably arose in early 17th century in Scotland, but the first Grand Lodge was in London, England in 1717. And we started spreading out the world, mostly with British merchants and British regiments. See, we are looming large in the imagination of our foes. I'm just going to start off with three of my favorite anti-Masonic quotes. German priest in 1780, well, this is more a summation rather than a quote, but that the Jews who crucified the Savior were Freemasons, that Pontius Pilate and King Herod were wardens, officers in a lodge, and here's my favorite, that Judas used his 30 pieces of silver to pay for his initiation into a Masonic lodge. A 1990 book called The New World Order claims that Freemasonry, quote, efforts to replace America's Judeo-Christian heritage was a brutal form of paganism, leading ultimately to the worship of Lucifer and the elimination of every vestige of Christianity. And this piece of logic that would make Aristotle proud, because FDR was a 32nd degree Mason and our 32nd president, and Truman was a 33rd degree Mason and our 33rd president, that it is very clear that our elections are of no consequence. The election process has been completely overrun by the Freemasons. Now, just before we get really into the meat of the lecture, There were many other in the 18th century secret societies, and a good chunk of Europe, ad nauseum, was discussing the ideas of the Enlightenment. But Freemasonry, especially on the continent, was very elite. The members tended to be elite, and they were much more anti-clerical against the Pope, the Catholic Church, and they were more into trying to have more liberal governments than perhaps in England that already had a form of constitutional monarchy. Titled Defending the Christian Freemason, many faiths have accused Freemasonry as being deistic, universalistic, pantheistic, satanic, or even deliberately set up to mock Christianity. For instance, in our third degree, we have a resurrection scene, and it is stated there was no evidence for that we deliberately did that to mock Christ's resurrection. Now, we do have huge numbers of quasi-religious elements in Freemasonry, and our rituals are drenched in the Judeo-Christian Bible. But nevertheless, we are not a religion nor a substitute for religion. This is my personal view, and I'm not trying to take away from the sincerity of our opponents in any way and their theological discussions. But to me, it's a bit like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, in that it's very clear that the two main men who created Freemasonry at the beginning of the 18th century, John Anderson and John de Ségulier, they were both active and devout Protestant ministers, and they had absolutely no intention of creating an alternative religion. And also in regular Masonry, it's different from continental Masonry, every man comes to Freemasonry with his belief in salvation or the afterworld. And so it wouldn't be Freemasonry's views on that, it would be whatever his views are. That's another thing that they accuse us of promising, if you are a good Mason, that you will achieve salvation. Leo XIII, battling Freemasonry, 1891 cartoon in Puck magazine in London. The first Catholic attack on Freemasonry was Pope Clement XII in 1738 in his papal bull In Eminenti. And there's a quote, "Thus these aforesaid societies and all prudent and upright men have passed the same judgment on them as being depraved and perverted." Charming indictment. Now, the first assault on Freemasonry was really more political than theological. There were a variety of reasons. I should only get into one of them. There were the Stuart king had been kicked out for being Catholic from Protestant. They brought in a Hanoverian dynasty. Well, some of his supporters were busy running lodges in France especially, but in other Catholic countries. And then the Hanoverian lodges supporting the king were actually poaching Catholic members from these lodges. So the king in exile complained to the Pope, but at the same time, the French foreign minister was complaining to the Pope about the activities of these Catholic lodges that were offending England. And at the time, France wanted to be chummy with England. So the Pope basically went a plague on both your houses and banned Freemasonry. Now, the main French attack, papal attack on Freemasonry was Leo XIII in 1884. His encyclical Humanum, a major assault on Freemasonry, as Pope viewed the fraternity as the engine of the secular assault on the Catholic Church. Quote, "The Freemasons wish to destroy the religion which God himself has established." Now, the Pope was reacting to a titanic struggle. They weren't just the Freemasons. The Freemasons were the sharp tip of the spear, but they couldn't have done it on their own. And the popes that started out in the 8th century as having actually not only spiritual power, but a lot of secular power, which the kings had gradually clawed back. But now the main thing the Pope had were marriages, burials, especially education. The Jesuits have a saying, give us a child till the age of 7, and he'll be ours for life. So it's very important to the Catholic Church to have control of education, and Freemasons, especially in France and Italy, were stripping successfully the Catholic Church of that. And then to add insult to injury, in Italy, Giuseppe Garibaldi and Giuseppe Manzini, two of the great unifiers of Italy, were one of the main people responsible for stripping the Pope of his papal estates and forcing him just to have Vatican City. So from the Pope's point of view, they viewed Freemasons as not only robbing them of their educational opportunities, but also stealing their territories. If imminenti was the legislation against Freemasonry, 1739 was ordinance by a cardinal was the administrative law. And basically, and I'm slightly exaggerating, but helping Freemasons, thinking about being a Freemason, practically dreaming about being a Freemason, were all against the Catholic Church. And to show you how you could either be sentenced to death, to the galleys, like war vessels, have a heavy fine, or have your house demolished. And criteria for having your house demolished, and I quote, penalty of demolition, any common conjectures, hints, or presumptions may and shall suffice as a presumption of knowledge in the landlords of such houses. So hardly rigorous standard before your house was torn down. This is a print of John Custos, a Swiss businessman living in England, supposedly tortured by the Portuguese Inquisition. He had founded a lodge in 1941, and he was let loose, and he published a book about his ordeal, which caused a huge stink in Europe at the time. Now, I'm not completely confident of this because some people were killed and many imprisoned, but I don't think the Catholic Inquisition against Freemasonry, again, because of the eliteness of its members and the sheer number of people who were interested in the Enlightenment, really suffered as severely as the Jews and the Muslims in the early, and the heretics in the early Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. Just very briefly, in the US, a slightly different situation. Catholic immigrants were coming into a deeply Protestant country that really liked being Freemasons. So even though the Catholic Church never completely abandoned its anti-Masonic stance, it just wasn't practical to wage a war with an organization that by and large was helping Catholics integrate into American society. So it's a little different in Europe. Freemasons battling with the Catholic Church. In America, we've more or less been welcoming to them. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Judgment of the Soul. I just have this in quickly to indicate some, for the Southern Baptist view, even though now a man can follow his conscience, he can be a Southern Baptist and a Freemason. But the stuff that they used to prove that we were wicked is that in one of our Southern Rite, Scottish Rite rituals, there's an allegory of Egyptian gods judging a man's life. And they were claiming that, the Egyptian gods were real to us, and it was a real sort of happening. And then just quickly, we use as our titles for our lodge officers and our Grand Lodge officers, worshipful and right worshipful. And they claim that we are worshiping our officers. So little stuff like that, just an example as to how people get worked up about us. Knight by, God, I've forgotten his name. Hogarth, yes, thank you, Hogarth. Now, often we're portrayed as a pretentious drinking society. Now, they're true, there was a lot of drinking, especially in Georgian England. They were tended to be heavy drinkers. And we did sing lustily three-part harmony, often to indicate symbolically uniting people from different backgrounds. But at the same time that they were feasting lavishly and drinking, they were exposed to scientific lectures, scientific experiments, the different mathematical and philosophical ideas that were circling. Just one example, and I'm not sure, especially the aristocratic English lodges would have been quite like this, but a 1780 Viennese lodge in Austria, minor aristocrats and middle class, and they had published learned journals. They wrote poetry. They had visiting scientists, but consciously to distinguish, to create an intellectual sexuality or intellectual view, in contrast to probably the uptight manners necessary in regular society. They encouraged heavy drinking, gluttony, poor table manners, belching, farting, and some of their songs were hymns to their love affairs and their virility. So just to show you what complex in the 18th century Masonic lodges could be. As a French, this is a scene showing our oath-taking or creation of candidates. As a French journalist said, nobody knows quite what Masons are up to, but thank you. But everyone suspects they are up to something. Now, in English law, English-speaking world, the secrecy, well, they wanted to keep it private, but it was more an esprit de corps, something to bind us. Now, again, in the continental lodges where they were more active politically, they really did want to keep their meetings secret. But today, we basically have secrecy, sorry, I forgot, because the medieval guilds that we model ourselves on were obviously very desirous of keeping their trade secrets and their recognition symbols to themselves. And we strive for a little bit of privacy because we would prefer that our candidates are introduced to our beautiful ceremonies without knowing exactly what is going on. But if they really wanted to, they could find out. Well, as you can see, at least in the US, signs showing where lodges are. Most of our lodges have the square compass on them. We publish sometimes notices of our meetings in the papers. And most of the information about us can be found on the internet. Now, if you go on the internet, I want you to be careful because there's a lot of groups out there that hate our guts. So you have to be careful what you believe in. But I mean, as early as 1730, a man leaked our rituals. So they've been out for a long time. Networking, as you say here, it's a lecture, advertising a lecture for networking in 19th century Stroud in England. First place in the 18th century, patronage and nepotism was rampant. And 18th century Masonic lodges, they're very aristocratic and high bureaucratic members, was a very good place to network. And we are supposed to help our members. In fact, today we sort of regret that we don't have the resources to really help our members, but nevertheless, we are really supposed to abide by laws and not do dishonest things to help unfair things to help our members. But I think a lot of the views that people have about Freemasonry is because of the conspiracy theories and this view of us as our tentacles all over the country. I mean, as an example, not too long ago, English Home Secretary said, even though there was no evidence of us infiltrating the government, no evidence at all, he said he felt obliged to have formal parliamentary inquiries because the English people were uneasy. So that was sufficient to, I mean, even though we do like to help each other, but it's not on the vast and unfair scale that people imagine. But I think it's those conspiracy theories. The Duke of Wharton, 1698, 1731, a brilliant orator, but he was a supporter of the Stuart King, so he got into trouble. He was a Grand Master in England, and he was basically kicked out. And I guess he was peeved about that. So he created this group called Gormagons to be anti-Masonic. Now here's a print showing the mysteries of Freemasonry brought to light by the Gormagons, again by William Hogarth, an engraving in 1724. Now, mainly, they didn't have parades. They mainly wrote nasty or sarcastic newspaper articles. And it's not really clear whether they were just a very elaborate practical joke or, a sincere group meant to be taken seriously. They claim descent from the first Chinese emperor, and they were founded around 1724. Now, remember de Sagulier that I mentioned? Hogarth was also Mason and apparently didn't like de Sagulier because the woman on the donkey is a caricature of de Sagulier. And also, and I really digress here, one of Hogarth's other prints called The Congregation, and half the congregation is asleep, was also de Sagulier. Francis Dashwood, 11th Baron Le Despencer, 1706-1781, a British Tory politician, and he was part of the order of the Friars. There were several of them, but they were basically into orgies and mocking religion, either, depending on your viewpoint, grossly misbehaving or having a really good time. Anyway, for political reasons, he didn't like Freemasonry, so the Freemasons used to have parades through London associated with their principal feast days in their Masonic accoutrements, and he hired beggars and prostitutes to walk ahead of the procession, making fun of the Freemasons, to the point that they eventually gave up having their parades. Catherine the Great, 1729, 1796, Empress of Russia, was a very talented ruler who had little admiration for Freemasonry, which he thought was one of the greatest aberrations to which the human race has succumbed. She further went on to call us a strange fad among males only, and a mixture of religious ritual and childish games. So obviously, no love in her heart for us. And also, along with many of her fellow 18th century rulers, and even authoritarian regimes to this day, they were very nervous. She was very nervous about our international contacts. She wasn't thrilled that the Russian aristocracy had this supposed network of foreign contacts. Liberty Leading the People by Eugène Delacroix, 1830. Freemasons and the Illuminati have been blamed for the French Revolution, the incredible turmoil that engulfed Europe in 1848, and the Russian Revolution of 1717. The major conspiracy theories involving us were created in 1797 by l'Abbé Brunel, often called the father of conspiracy theories. and a man called John Robinson, a Scottish scholar, who basically claimed that the Illuminati and Freemasons were behind these events. I mean, I think sort of what happens is that the conservatives can't really admit that what their actions led to the anger of the people, so they have to find a scapegoat, and the Freemasons and the Illuminati were very convenient. Robinson's book, long title, Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, carried on in secret meetings at the Freemasons, Illuminati, and reading societies. So a broad indictment, and to this day, his book, his views are still quoted. Now, the Illuminati, and unfortunately for us, the way they chose to spread was to try to take over Masonic lodges. I think they got their hands on 7 lodges before they were suppressed. They weren't by our standards, they were just an Enlightenment group, but slightly more scary probably to rulers because they're more politically active, or their ideas were more political than the Freemasons, who more taught by example. They were suppressed in, I think, 1784, and as far as most scholars feel, they don't exist, but it's very hard to prove, you know, a negative. Alexander Kerensky, there might be some grain of truth to some of these things. There was a group called Political Masonry, where they had been had been Masons, was associated with the Grand Orient of France, but they dropped that and devoted themselves to politics. They even admitted women so they could network further. And Kerensky was the first prime minister of the provincial government. There were 2 insurrections in February, and in October, the Bolshevik one. And scholars at first thought they didn't have much to do with the revolution. Now they're admitting that they might have had something to do. And now there's some tentative suggestions they might actually have played a fairly large role. As I say, one of the reasons they're hard to study is that they had to be very secret, because the Tsar's secret police are trying to root out anti-Tsar activities. And as far as we know, they didn't have, it wasn't a Jewish Masonic conspiracy as people had it. They didn't probably have a lot of Jewish members. The Death of Marat by Jacques-Louis David, 1793. One of the reasons that we're still associated or people think we're involved with the French Revolution is, for whatever reason, 4 out of the 10 principal key members of the French Revolution were Freemasons. And it's possible, I had 6, but my colleague unfortunately did some research and suggested that 2 of them were iffy, were involved. So, and the Grand Orient of France is actually really proud of this association. But in general, the Grand Orient did not take an official position. It caused a lot of tension in lodges. There were some for the revolution, some against. And the bulk in the middle sat out the revolution. And sure, the lodges helped propagate Enlightenment ideas, but as I mentioned earlier, lots of other French people were involved in doing this. So as I say, no, obviously such a broad movement as the French Revolution wasn't solely the Freemasons, but it is interesting in the climate of the times that 4 out of 10 or possibly 6 out of 10 were, now they had different, Marat was a fiery Republican radical, and Lafayette, for instance, one of the 4 was a moderate monarchist and an aristocrat, and Marat hated Lafayette. The assassination of William Morgan from a French 1886 print. Now, actually, Morgan was a middle-aged bald but this is idealized. Anyway, Freemasons almost certainly kidnapped and very probably murdered William Morgan, who was threatening to publish our secrets. And this combined with a perception that prominent New York Freemasons were trying to influence the course of justice caused a huge explosion that almost drove Freemasonry to its knees. It went from 100,000 to 40,000. Members, houses were burnt, Masons were assaulted. This only went on for like 15 years, but it was a really scary moment for Freemasonry. And in Pennsylvania, a man called Thaddeus Stevens, who ended up being a great advocate for African Americans as slaves when he was serving in the Pennsylvania legislature. He was vehemently anti-Masonic. They think maybe because he had a club foot, we didn't let him in. We have to be careful. I mean, there's always an explanation as to why he could have hated us just for political reasons, not necessarily because he had a club foot and we didn't admit him. Anyway, he was an ardent anti-Masonic person, and he summoned our Grand Master and other prominent Masons to Harrisburg and tried to make them testify under oath, and they refused. They got sequestered for a while and put in prison. But our Grand Master Dallas, who went on to become vice president, held his ground and sang the praises of Freemasonry and didn't cave in. Another 1886 publication was featuring the demon Baphomet, which the Leo Taxiel borrowed from Eliphas Levi's invented demonic concoction Baphomet. And Leo Taxiel, over time, concocted over several years an elaborate, lurid, and very successful hoax about a secret Masonic society headed by Albert Pike, a titan, scholarly titan of the Southern Scottish Rite, that was devoted to sexual orgies, ritual murder, and above all, demon worship. Now, it turns out that Freemasons had rejected him, and for reasons that escape me at the moment, he hated the Catholic Church. So this was his way of getting the Catholic Church, which leapt at the opportunity. This is just the way the Catholic Church thought Freemasons behaved. So they got behind it. Anyway, it's to this day, again, still believed by some people, even though it was proved to be a fraud. And it has, to this day, consequences for us Freemasons. For instance, here, Masonic Lodge is a satanic cult. Christians get out of the Young League. Some of the more intense evangelical Protestant groups think that we worship demons, and that is in part because of this. Now, Albert Pike sort of brought this upon himself. He chose to plagiarize huge chunks of Eliphas, that I was telling you about, who wrote a book, among other things, featuring Lucifer as the god of light. Now, even though Pike was misquoted, if he hadn't chosen to write heavily about Lucifer as the god of light, we probably wouldn't be in this situation. Protocols of the Elders of Zion, published in 1903, but they really didn't gain traction till Russians fleeing the Russian Revolution brought it with them. So they sort of spread around Europe and around 1920. And even though they were proven a fraud a couple of years later, they're completely plagiarized. It's not only that a fake document, but the authors plagiarized almost everything from other authors. But it's a very compelling read. So it took off like a house on fire. It was probably created by the Tsar's secret police to blame Jews for the unrest at the time in Russia. Oh, and it's so current still that even group blamed Jewish elders for COVID-19. It spread to Japan. Now, Japan didn't have a lot of anti-Masonry or anti-Jewishness up until Japanese officers ran across the protocols when they invaded Vladivostok after World War I. One of the main sources of anti-Jewishness, for instance, was they'd been really struck by Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. So they didn't really have a Jewish experience, nor Freemasons were really mostly European, and under an agreement with the Japanese government, were very discreet. And the most that happened was that they were arrested and interrogated, except for if you had not bothered to learn Japanese as a Freemason, it went more rougher with you. When a Japanese representative at a German conference against Freemasonry, and I think he was, I'm surprised he managed to say this with a straight face, but maybe they all believed him, said that Judeo-Masonry is forcing the Chinese to turn China into a spearhead for an attack on Japan, and thereby forcing Japan to defend itself against this threat. Japan is at war not with China, but with Freemasonry. I think it's pretty ballsy, so excuse my language, to blame their invasion of China for resources and imperialism on the fact that we Freemasons are supposedly attacking them. And even to this day, Japanese publications that are anti-Masonic and buy into the protocol idea of, I think, I tried to go back. The protocol, I apologize, its main theme is a Jewish Masonic scheme to take over the world. But we Freemasons are not equal partners. We're the Jews' mostly unwitting stooges, and we don't get to share at the end the power or the money. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. The Syrian edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, 205, it's still very popular in the Arab world, even though it's been debunked. They believe it, they teach it in their schools. And to show how it can still work, I'm sorry, I took a slide out. That's not there. In 2016, the FBI foiled an attempted bombing or attack on the Scottish Rite building in Milwaukee. A young Muslim man, inspired by these views of a Masonic Jewish conspiracy, thought he could strike a blow for his team by attacking the Scottish Rite building in the US. You see, it's a Vichy government poster, 1940, and it wasn't just the Catholic Church that felt that Freemasons undermined the foundations of society and degraded core national values. Here you can see, I don't know if Freemasonry is actually one of those topics mentioned, but you can see viewed as destabilizing, while work, family, and country are the solid values that the Vichy government was selling. And once again, you see internationalism is one of the things. These right-wing governments, once again, one of their main concerns about Freemasonry was our supposed solid network that doesn't really exist. There's no central Masonic authority. There's no Masonic Grand Lodge. Now, both Vichy France and Nazi Germany, actually, for a while, you couldn't be a bureaucrat or in the army. if you were a Freemason, and they seized the assets and archives of all the lodges in France and Germany, but actual murdered Freemasons were quite few. I mean, they had to specifically be of the wrong ethnic background or engaged in politics or the resistance. And they brought them back. The French all of a sudden realized that half their colonial officers were Freemasons. So they brought them back, and the Germans realized that the Freemasons were too valuable and elite, and they needed them. So by 1938, the lucky devils were even allowed to be SS soldiers if they wanted to. Now, in the German territories, it's a different story. They think maybe up to 200,000 Freemasons were killed or put in concentration camps and had to wear a pink triangle. Now, again, it's not completely sure how many of those whose only crime was being a Freemason, and it may have been other reasons. Just a couple of quick posters. The Ligue Française was a collaborative political movement that wanted to work with Germany. And you see the French propaganda poster around 1942, and the ghost of a French World War I soldier is kicking out the Jews and the Freemasons. And here is a Phalangist or Franco political portrait, and a young man, a fascist soldier during the Civil War, cleanses Spain of Bolshevism, social injustice, Masons, separatism, anarchists, and politicians. Franco said, Masonry and communism, we have to extirpate these two evils from our land, a speech in 1945. And Franco, it's really odd, had a visceral hatred against Freemasons. I mean, even more than the communists. He just hated our guts. And I'm not sure why. Again, the popular speculation, he apparently had a father and brother that he really hated. And maybe that was the reason. A German 1941 letter, a document instructing Nazi party members how to behave, said the natural hostility of the peasant against the Jews and his hostility against the Freemasons as a servant of the Jews must be worked up to a frenzy. And then Mussolini said Masonry must be destroyed and Masons should have no right to citizenship in Italy. And then in 1925, and in the following years, his henchmen went out and burnt Masonic temples and homes and killed Freemasons. But it wasn't on a massive, I mean, it's easy for me to say here. I mean, it must have been pretty scary for Italian Masons, but it wasn't on a massive scale. You would think in England, where Freemasonry was born, and the Duke of Kent, the Queen's first cousin, is a Grand Master, that everything would be sweetness and light, but unfortunately not. Enough of Enough is the title of a letter that a Grand Lodge of England official had published in several newspapers, threatening to go to the European Court of Justice because he thought Masonry was being treated very unfairly. And the two main things that had provoked this, police commission in its report said that Freemasons were single-handedly opposing advancement of people of color and women in the police force. Also, the Guardian newspaper wrote a nasty little article implying that there were two lodges of Freemasons for members of Parliament. And anyway, they wrote an article implying that these lodges were up to no good. So they got fed up. But this was just the culmination of things. In 1994, Martin Short's published Inside the Brotherhood, as you see, an explosive Secrets of the Freemasonry. And this was apparently a compelling, I haven't read it, but apparently a compelling hatchet job. Anyway, it really stirred things up. Parliament investigated Freemasonry. For a while, judges and police officers had to register their membership. And in 2009, that stopped. But as you can see, even in England, home of Freemasonry, things are not completely rosy. Leo Gelly, worshipful master of Propaganda Due, P2, in the early 70s, a huge banking scandal in the Vatican revealed that there was a secret right-wing network, including of powerful Italians, including the three heads of Italian intelligence, plotting to take over the country. Now, P2 had been kicked out by the Grand Orient earlier, so really the Grand Orient of Italy had nothing to do with this, but it caused big trouble for the Italian Freemasons because it plays right into the views of anti-Masons secretly in charge of banks, a network of right-wing people plotting. So it caused a lot of hassle. I think it's subsided a bit. And in 2017, 2018, they raided some Masonic lodges in Sicily. I'm not going to read them out. You can see the various different Italian mafias. And they discovered that in some of the lodges, mafia bosses had joined in order to network with politicians and prominent businessmen. Now, the poor rest of the Masons in Sicily and elsewhere were outraged. They said, look, most of us spend our time badly supported by the state trying to fight off the mafia, and why are you turning on us for just a few, bad apples? But again, it caused tensions. An Italian newspaper, there's only one really, suggested banning Freemasonry and keeping a stern eye on Rotary and other institutions like that were suspected of somehow being under the influence of Freemasons. End of time deception, the New World Order was a picture on a 2010 article on witchcraft, how we Freemasons were into witchcraft, which we're not, by the way. But you can see it's still going strong. Now, oddly enough, the New World Order is not necessarily conservative. It's to improve poverty and nutrition, but it wants to have one language, and it's the elites imposing this. So even though some of their goals might be worthy, it's creepy in that, well, Lord Acton said power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. But they're more, according to my readings, they're more left-wing than necessarily right-wing. Oh, I forgot to mention, in 2020, Catholic Cardinal wrote an open letter to President Trump, which President Trump was thrilled and promptly retweeted to all his fans, that basically claimed that the New World Order, heavily influenced by Masonic ideas, was behind the Black Lives Matter riot, because they were trying to stop Trump from gaining a second term. So you see these theories are still out there. Oh, I got rid of my the picture of Paris was the Eiffel Tower being grabbed by Masonic hand. It was an illustration for 2012. 2012 article in Bloomberg News about French Masonry. As I hope we've seen in the talk, most of the people dislike us for good things, that we're progressive, for freedom of religion, political rights and stuff like that. But as I did show, I think that we are capable of aggression. I mean, we were definitely involved in fighting the Catholic Church in some ex-Catholic countries. Now, stories still abound about Freemasonry's global ambitions and our almost legendary corrupt networking prowess out there. As Alain Boer, a former Grand Master of France, said, we don't like these stories, obviously, but at the same time, we love them because they make us feel like we're still important. See, I did not train sufficiently on this machine, but it's good in a way. We'll live on. I mean, in an era where what some people claim that Jewish laser beams from space started the California wildfires. Well, we'll always have a cozy home. Now, in the fevered imagination of our fellow Earthlings. Now, of course, we prefer to be known for our fundamental decency and our devotion to the welfare of humanity. But hey, if we live on for, because us and the Illuminati and the Jews are still plotting to take over the world. Anyway, thank you very much. I don't know if you're interested, but we have another presentation April 24th. Once again, thank you all for attending, and I very, very much appreciate that. Thank you.